Farlost, created by John Miro.
38. I'm fine, First. Arnell smiled and nodded across the tank at Ron Taggart. As fine as any of us, yeah, I think so too, Arnell said. He looked over at Vice President Burkov, where he floated close to another security officer, pulled off emergency repair detail by Montaigne herself to escort the man. They were 2 tanks down from CNC now. This one last tank, a couple of airlocks, and a couple of turns away from the med tank. Arnell gave an exaggerated shrug. Well, there's nothing much to do right now, and you are hearing voices, he continued. Taggart looked away. Maybe Doc Sanders can help you find out where those voices are coming from, Arnell murmured again. Ron looked back, his face alive with relief and gratitude. That smile faltered. Just wish I didn't feel like I was being locked up. He looked hurt, Arnell realized. Don't think of it like that, Ron. We're not sending you to Sanders because we're afraid you'll... Well, Arnell cast a look back at Burkov. We're worried about you. Taggart set his jaw and nodded. Arnell gauged the approaching airlock and tried to resist his next question. Taggart snorted. Don't have to be psychic to read your mind. Nah, I don't know what's coming. They're not wearing people we knew to talk to me like the lights did. I think they meant well, but they were asshats. The people coming now, I like 'em. I know they're coming to help. Arnell didn't have to ask anything else as they neared the airlock. He was relieved Ron couldn't read his mind all the time, like he had when he'd tuned into his memories of his Ina. As for the rest, who was coming to help? He'd have to wait. He trusted Ron Taggart. The man had proven himself as far as Arnell was concerned. Crazy and weird were relative terms out here. He was starting to come to grips with that. He looked over his shoulder to where the other security officer, John Pruitt, impossibly young, blonde-haired, and serious-looking all at once, hovered just a few feet behind Burkov. Pruitt was watching Burkov with hard eyes. Arnell felt sure the diligence was driven by more than the commander's order. Burkov looked unhinged, with pale skin, red eyes, and a visual tremble. Oh, he's not hearing any voices, Taggart said low. Arnell bit back his agreement. This was still a Hascom vice president they were talking about. He couldn't wipe off the grin that followed, as he thought again about how much his attitudes had shifted in light of the calamity that had struck his crew. Surviving sure changed your worldview. He looked back on all his run-ins with the commander, both commanders, Ed Dwyer, rest his soul, and Commander Montaigne. He'd never really trusted Montaigne when Dwyer brought her on board. Before serving with Dwyer, Villanueva hadn't gotten on with any of the servicemen who'd left the military for the top-tier posts Hascom offered. He'd never been able to get rid of his suspicion they'd rather shoot at a problem than resolve it. Then the shit hit the fan. Hit Dwyer too, and left the crew in Montaigne's hands. And she'd stayed calm, made the decisions she needed to, fast enough to get Beecham's light show up and running, and save most of the souls on board during unimaginable chaos. And, much to his surprise, he found he liked the chaos too. A little voice in the back of his head warned him writing tickets for corporate infractions wasn't going to feel quite right after he put all this behind him. Another little voice wondered how the hell they could ever put all this behind them. He played whack-a-mole with the little voices as they closed on the airlock. He grabbed a handhold and quickly turned himself, bleeding off speed. He felt the vibrations of the engines through his grip, surprised for a moment by their strength. The ship was still gaining speed, lending a little weight to his body, on top of the little that the Thorn far below was lashing at them. Just enough that if he stood still he'd slowly sink back down towards the airlock, now that it was down again. It reminded him of the airplanes Hascom still used to simulate zero-G for the new recruits, the vomit comets that would climb high in the sky, then fall fast, negating much of the effect of gravity. Near the bottom of that fall, gravity would creep back. That was the most dangerous time, when he and the other seasoned spacers would watch out for raw recruits who'd forgotten gravity had only been temporarily suspended, lest they end up with bruised body parts and bruised egos when the plane landed again. He thought back to what Beecham and the Betty's engineer, Gruber, had said about how the Thorn was sicking more and more gravity on them to draw them down. He shuddered, squeezing the hand grip tight and willing the engines never designed to escape orbit to do more than their jobs, to get Six and her crew to the Betty McKenna before... Burkov made an involuntary sound of surprise, and Arnell looked back. "Need a hand, Mr. Vice President?" he called out to the flailing man, but he managed to stop himself at another handhold with a minimum of self-injury. Burkov's eyes darted over to him, then to Pruitt. "I can stop myself, thank you very much, and I don't need to see a doctor." Taggart had the airlock open, and another crewman was flying through, back the way they'd come. He wore elbow-length gloves and had a tank of emergency pressure sealant on his back. Arnell traded nods with the man. "Feels weird seeing other folks in the halls again now," Taggart said, and moved to the side to let the others pass through. Arnell's nose wrinkled, Ron's words reminding him of the smell of burnt rubber the air scrubbers hadn't managed to remove yet. It's true, he thought, as he waved Burkov and Pruitt through the airlock. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Vice President," Arnell began again, speaking quietly as the man passed. "Command Montaigne and I—" Burkov's white knuckles grabbed onto the frame of the airlock, and he glared up at Arnell, muscles bulging in his neck with the strain. "Montaigne and you are deciding my fate, and I get no say. People like me and Goss, we built Hascom. Now some ancient law says you get to be in charge because people like us picked you and paid you?" Arnell kept the sternness from his face. There it was, the arrogance of the rich. He felt something stir in his gut. He remembered the squalor of his village in the Philippines as a child, and his determination to remake himself, become someone who had the money and power to care for his loved ones. Remembered his promise to use that power to put an end to the rampant, unchecked abuses and corruptions of the public officials selling his people's heritage to people just like Burkov. Cut to 20 years later, and he'd forgotten those hopes and moved to the USA, leaving the corruption behind, leaving the village and all the people who'd raised him as a boy behind. Amazing what a near-death experience reminded you of, he thought sourly. "Move along, Mr. Vice President," Arnell said coldly. Burkov's face paled again, and he looked away, immediately cowed. Arnell wasn't sorry. Pruitt had stopped on the other side of the lock, watching the VP and his first officer, so fresh-faced and lean in his black work suit with the security department icon on the shoulder, except Arnell could see the twin tensions in his face. Who do you side with when a command officer who'd been grooming and training you for months was suddenly on the other side of an argument from one of the minor deities of the corporation that controlled your future? It's always hard when Mummy and Daddy fight, Arnell thought, and it brought a chuckle to his throat. Don't worry, Pruitt. Just do your job and forget about who you're escorting. He gently clapped the man on the security badged shoulder. Just do what's right. The senior officers will be here to take any heat when we get back home. Pruitt's forehead lines eased. Yes, sir, he said, expelling a breath, then immediately looked stricken, ducked and hurried through. Arnell followed, chuckling, and cycled the airlock closed behind him. He stared at the amber flashing light on the panel beside the airlock. They weren't out of this yet. They didn't even understand what it was they were trying to escape from yet. And then there was the matter of getting home, as he had just promised the green officer they would. He followed the others along the curve of the airlock assemblies connecting the stacked tanks. He wondered why the life-and-death struggle was coming so easy to him, and why the return to the way things were, to the corporate track, filled him with far more dread. He shook his head to clear it, filing the concern away, knowing they weren't there yet. They were far from normal. He smiled. You're fine, Arnell, he told himself. As fine as any of us. He kicked off to catch up with Taggart and the others.
Farlost. Music by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Learn more at servingworlds.com.
Hi, John Miro here. Farlost is brought to you by my backers at Patreon. Patronage starts at $1 a month, or about 25 cents a cliffhanger. Patreon.com. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support.